One of the more controversial stories in the New Testament is that of the Canaanite woman, in other words, a non-Jew asking Jesus for help. She asks for help because her daughter is troubled by an unclean spirit, as Mark's Gospel puts it. Jesus ignores her initially, then in the conversation compares her to a dog before changing his mind when she continues her pleading. This is a story that appears in Mark chapter 7 and Matthew chapter 15, but is missing from Luke and John. This rejection of the Gentile woman's pleas is a pretty curious one, and it's a difficult one to justify or comprehend even for Christians. So why the reluctance by Jesus to help this woman in the first place? Why ignore then insult a desperate woman before eventually helping her? Well, it's possible to put a positive spin on anything, and many Christians tend to try and reinterpret the story rather than take it at face value. One idea is that he was testing her faith. But a test of faith raises several problems. Firstly, if Jesus was divine, he should have known her strong faith anyway, making a test redundant. He certainly never tests other people's faith in the same manner. Only this Gentile woman is ever tested, never Jews. Secondly, why is he testing the mother at all? If he had to carry out a test of faith, it should have been carried out on the girl rather than the mother, for that's the person who's being healed. For all we know, the daughter had absolutely no interest in Jesus. Why test one person when it's another that needs a spiritual assistance? As for Jesus insulting her by comparing her to a dog, again it's interpreted in as benign a manner as possible. Jesus didn't really mean a dog, rather a puppy or a house pet. So in a sense, it was a show of love towards the woman, it's argued. Others argue it was said more in humour or banter. Nevertheless, a dog is a dog, and whether it's a pet or not, it still signifies that you're equating a human to an animal. More importantly, he's giving the person second-class status. Matthew also points out that Jesus doesn't reply to her initially, and this makes it difficult to argue he was both testing her or exchanging banter with her. Thirdly, why compare her to a dog at all, even if it's in banter? The woman is in distress with her daughter possessed by a demon. Surely a more diplomatic and empathetic reply was more appropriate. So let's take a closer look at the story first and then see how Origen, the 2nd century Christian scholar and one of the earliest Christian polemicists, tries to explain this rather strange behaviour by Jesus. Origen is important in that he lived in the 3rd century and therefore used justifications that were used at the time for this behaviour. To keep the video short, we'll make some necessary assumptions so we can stick to the story proper. We'll assume Jesus was divine and had supernatural powers, and we'll also assume for the time being that devils, demons and unclean spirits, as the Bible terms them, exist and have a propensity for possessing humans for some unexplained reason. These are subjects in their own right, and I'll address them in greater depth in future videos. The story starts off in rather an interesting fashion. The Gospel of Mark describes Jesus moving to Tyre and Sidon and hiding in a house to escape attention for a while from the Pharisees. It is probable, Origen wrote, that he sought to avoid the Pharisees who were offended at his teaching, waiting for the time for his suffering, which was more fitting and rightly appointed. In other words, he decided to stay out of harm's way for a while. But Jesus finding a place to hide is problematic. Why would a divine being, somebody who can walk on water, calm a storm and feed 5,000 people, have to resort to hiding? He could have used his powers of persuasion or even a miracle to make himself invisible, for instance, for a while. Physically hiding in a house is surely unworthy of a divine being, and you'd expect something a little more noble or heroic, perhaps. But there's a second and bigger issue, and that's the fact that he was unsuccessful at concealing himself. So we have the paradox of an all-powerful, omnipotent being foiled in his plans by 1st century peasants. Anyway, let's leave that issue and move on to Jesus actually meeting the woman herself. The woman pleads with Jesus, asking him to cast out the devil that's possessing her daughter. Now, Jesus had been curing people elsewhere according to the Gospels, but the people he cured were Jews. This woman was different. She was a Gentile. Matthew describes her as a Canaanite, while Mark describes her as Greek. Jesus hadn't come across many Jews before, and in fact there are very few, if any, Greeks or Romans mentioned at all in the Gospels. His reaction is an odd one. He says he needs to give priority to the Jews, comparing Jews to children and Gentiles to dogs. "I'm not sent but unto the lost sheep of Israel," he says to the woman. And this is as clear a message as you can get to her and others that he's not interested in Gentiles but was preaching to Jews only. The woman doesn't question why her race counted against her. Instead, she replies that she accepts she is inferior and therefore lower priority than the Jews. She remarks even dogs are happy to eat the crumbs that fall off the table. Jesus is moved by her faith, changes his mind about helping her, and exorcises the devil from her daughter. He doesn't visit the daughter though, she being Canaanite, and just proceeds on his way. And that's the end of the story. Matthew fleshes out the story a little bit more, by the way, but not by much. He mentions the disciples weren't too interested in helping her either, she being a Canaanite. Now, the single most important point in this story is that Jesus changes his mind about helping the woman. Remember, Jesus is supposedly divine, and so this is God changing his mind. Initially, he had refused even to talk to her and then compared her to a dog, but he's touched by her faith. Now, the issue of God being persuaded to change his mind is a real big problem for all sorts of reasons, and certainly isn't compatible with divinity in my mind. Either it was right to help the woman or it wasn't. In fact, he changes his mind elsewhere as well in the Gospels, so we'll do a video on Jesus showing indecisiveness at some point. So how did the early Christians try and explain this Gospel story? Let's see how the Christian apologist Origen interprets the conversation with the Canaanite woman. Regarding his reason for moving into Gentile territory, Origen initially makes the point that Jesus went to these areas to save those Gentiles who believed in him. But this doesn't really explain why he then decided to hide in the same area if he's there to save these people. And it doesn't explain why he talked to the woman in the way he did if he's there to save her. In any case, Jesus left the area shortly afterwards rather than staying for a considerable time. After this, Origen makes a very strange remark, that the woman being Canaanite was actually prepared to be humiliated because of her background. Essentially, he argues that there was nothing wrong with that. After all, Jews did commonly call Gentiles dogs in those days, and the pagans were fully prepared to be called dogs. Only the Canaanitish woman came out of those borders and went forth from the state of being prepared for humiliation, he wrote. In other words, she was expecting to be rejected because of her birth, despite having faith in Jesus. So Origen pretty much admits that there is a genuine difference between the way Jesus treated Jews and Gentiles, and there is a full acceptance that Jesus came first and foremost for the Jews. The Canaanitish woman, therefore, because of her race, was not worthy even to receive an answer from Jesus, who acknowledged that he had not been sent by the Father for any other thing than to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, a lost race of souls possessed of clear vision. And in all honesty, it's pretty difficult for Origen to explain it any other way, really, as Jesus had made his stance on Gentiles pretty clear. Origen goes on to explain that Jesus reproaches her with baseness of birth, and that she rightfully acknowledges that the masters are of a nobler race. Her humility at acknowledging her second-class status means he agrees to her request. So summing up, Jesus, as far as Origen was concerned, did nothing wrong in bringing up her second-class status. She, a Gentile, was treated in the way a Gentile should have been. So why help her at all if Jesus' mission was only for the Jews? Well, Origen does wrestle with this issue, and in my opinion tries to have it both ways. He acknowledges that she belonged to an inferior race, and that being a Gentile she didn't deserve help. Our Saviour was sent by the Father to no others than to those lost Jews, he stresses. But at the end of the day, Jesus did help her, and this, he argues, was because the woman showed her faith and humility, and that was the key. Jesus, he argues, was happy to save the more intelligent, i.e. the people who believed in him. Assured that it is preeminently the work of the Word to save the more intelligent, for these are more akin to him than those who are duller. In other words, the woman proved her intelligence while accepting her inferiority to the Jews. The second reason Origen gives for Jesus not helping Gentiles is much more interesting and curious. He speculates that Jesus only had a certain limited amount of power that he could use. In the same way, a certain amount of money has to be used carefully on the right purchases, So Jesus had to spend his power wisely. This meant he was only to heal the Jewish people unless there was some exceptional circumstances. He uses the example of the woman who touches his garment and was healed to illustrate the idea of power leaving his body. At the time, Jesus declared, "Someone did touch me, for I perceived that power had gone forth from me." This, Origen wrote, proved he didn't have limitless power. For if he did have unlimited power, he wouldn't have felt his power leaving him. So the bulk of his power was meant for the sons of Israel, but with a little left over for contingencies like this Gentile woman who'd showed humility. This is an explanation you don't really hear from Christians these days, but may have been prevalent in Origen's days. Origen argues that the woman showed humility and accepted her second-class status, and therefore deserved the help from Jesus. Only he who is reproached as a dog and yet is not indignant at being called unworthy of the bread of children, and with all forbearance repeats the saying of that Canaanitish woman. So effectively, Gentiles must be prepared to accept their second-class status in front of Jesus if they want to be healed. Overall, I find Origen's explanations pretty weak. The fact remains Jesus was reluctant to help her, and that's hard to explain. He states clearly that he has come for the lost sheep of Israel. Most Christians will accept, and it's hard to argue otherwise, that Jesus' mission was to the Jews and that the Gentiles' time would come later. However, to his credit, Origen doesn't try and explain away the fact that Jesus calls a woman a dog and that it was meant as an insult. Gentiles were seen as lesser people by the Jews, and they were routinely called dogs in those times. And so Jesus was doing nothing out of the ordinary by treating her in the way he had. Put simply, there was nothing to explain in his conduct towards a woman.